Good morning. Welcome to our Boardwalk Talk program from the Dauphin Island Sea Lab Aquarium. My name is Mendel Graeber. I'm one of the educators at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab, and we are bringing our talk to you this morning from the salt marsh, as you can see here. And we are chatting about hermit crabs. So we have an abundance of hermit crabs. They've gotten still since we're crouching over them, but an abundance of hermit crabs in this little tidal creek right here. So there's a lot of movement that you can see from the hermit crabs in here. And we just stepped into this little creek and picked up some of these hermit crabs. So we're showing you kind of how abundant they are out here, but then we also have some that we picked up to give you a closer view.
So were these hermit crabs the same that you would buy at a souvenir store?
They are not terrestrial hermit crabs, which are the kind that you would usually buy at a pet store. So they cannot survive in a dry tank, like a terrarium with just, say, a sponge or a dish of water. They would have to have a saltwater aquarium. So if you go to the beach, these are very common on our beaches, the beaches in the northern Gulf, beaches of Alabama. I'm doing that to stir a little oxygen into this water. So if you go to our beaches, you're likely to find these hermit crabs. They're all the same species, the striped leg hermit crab, and they do need to be submerged in water. They can be out for a few minutes. If we hold them out of the water for a few minutes to talk about them, they're okay, but not, all day while you hang out at the beach. They wouldn't survive that. So if you did want to put some in a bucket with seawater and watch them for a few minutes, make sure you don't keep them out of the water more than a couple of minutes, and keep them in a bucket of seawater. In the summertime, when the water is warm, the oxygen comes out of the water faster, so you would need to refresh their water pretty often if you wanted to have them more than just a few minutes. And then they wouldn't make a good pet to take home with you. A lot of people wonder about taking them home, just sort of collecting a hermit crab from the beach instead of buying it at the pet store and putting it in a tank at home. But this species needs a saltwater aquarium.
How many species are there? Do you happen to know?
I am not sure. This is the only one that we find inshore, but we do have a couple of other species that we catch locally. But worldwide, I'm not sure how many different species there are.
And then do they create their own shells?
All right, so those of you who are watching, I'm going to give you a few seconds to think about that before I answer that question. So these shells that the hermit crabs are in, what kind of animal makes these shells? So I'm going to pull out 3 of them. So you can take a closer look at the shells, and then I'll answer the question. These shells are made by snails. So I'm going to set the hermit crabs down and show you these snails that we just pulled off the grass right over there. If you look at that opening, you can see sort of that little hard door. It's called an operculum that the snail has to close up its shell. These are periwinkle snails, and several of these hermit crabs that we have collected are in periwinkle snail shells. So the hermit crabs don't make the shells they live in. They live in snail shells typically. This snail is starting to come out here, so you can see a little bit of what the snail looks like. So the snail hatches with its shell. We have a couple of snail egg cases. This one is from a lightning whelk snail, which is what this assortment of shells is here, and it sort of shows this at different growth stages. And these are oyster drill snails, actually laid onto an oyster drill egg case. So these are oyster drill snail shells. And so they hatch out of these egg cases with shells. So these are some lightning whelk snails that never hatch. So sometimes these wash up on the beach and we find the shells of the babies inside the egg cases, the ones that never hatched. So that's what these are. And as they grow, they secrete mineral. So I'm going to give you another look at that little snail. He's crawling around, and I'm going to take them off my fingers so I can use my hand. So they grow, they secrete minerals like we secrete the minerals for our bones as we grow. And they spiral outward like this. And with this broken shell, you can see that spiral pattern. So this is the oldest point of the shell. So it corresponds to the little bump you see on the end, on the front end of these shells, the babies. And so as long as they're alive, as long as the snail is alive, its body is attached to this shell. And when it dies, the tissue part of the body rots, leaving behind the mineral part. It's kind of like, mammals leave bones behind. And then the hermit crabs will move into empty snail shells.
How often do they move into shells?
It depends on their stage of growth. So when they are younger, they will molt more often. And as they get bigger, they molt less often.
So do they molt similar to a blue crab, where they take their shell off, or a horseshoe crab?
Yeah, so if we are using the word shell here, let me clarify the difference between the exoskeleton, which is the part of the hermit crab's body that covers its legs, its eyes, its body, and then the shell that is the mollusk shell that is that came from a snail. So for the snail, this is like part of its body. It's kind of like a skeleton. For the hermit crab, it's kind of like a house. So it's not part of its body. It can't make it bigger. And so they will molt their exoskeletons, and then they also move from a smaller shell to a successively larger shell. So we've got some periwinkle shells in here that are smaller, some that are bigger. And then they will move into the periwinkle snails don't get that big. And so once the hermit crabs grow past the point where they'll fit into a periwinkle, they'll move into a different kind of snail shell. So we also have, these are all the same species of hermit crab, but they're in different species of snail shells. So we also have oyster drill snail shells with hermit crabs in them of various sizes. And then this is probably, these two, the oyster drills and the moon snails, are probably that one's covered in algae, so it's kind of hard to see. That's a moon snail there. Probably the two most common types of snail shells that you'll find on our beaches occupied by hermit crabs. This one is broken. There's a hermit crab living in this broken shell here.
When we talk about hermit crabs finding homes, they also can find strange homes as well.
They sometimes will live in, odd cup-shaped things that they can stick their abdomens in. We collected those hermit crabs from this creek right here, but we also brought a couple from the estuarium so that we could show you something a little different. So we have here a glass shell that was made for hermit crabs so that you can see the tail end of the hermit crab. So they have a soft tail end that they back into the shell, and then this is the part that you typically would see. It will kind of stick that part out of the shell in order to crawl around, in order to eat, and it will hang on to that shell with the tail end. And so you asked about whether they would live in odd things. They may find some bit of like a bottle cap, or maybe not a bottle, like a plastic bottle cap. Probably not something as shallow and wide as a tin bottle cap, but they might find odd things to live in sometimes, but typically they live in snail shells. We also have a different species. This is one of the different species that we have. We don't usually find this one on our beaches. They typically prefer to be subtidal, meaning they don't kind of come out at the shore's edge. They like to be a little deeper than the ones we find on our beaches, but we do have these in our local waters. I thought it might come out a little bit where you could see it, and it may. Maybe it will in a minute, and you can see it a little bit better.
So what are the parts of the body to a hermit crab? Like, what are their main, like, legs?
Yeah, so I'll go back and also say that we call them hermit crabs. They are in the same order as blue crabs and lady crabs, purple swimming crabs, as other true crabs, but they are in a different family. So they are a little bit different than other crabs you might be familiar with. So I think this part is called the anterior shield. The part that is has the exoskeleton, and it is harder right here before you get to that soft tail right there. And then they do have 10 legs, and one pair, not in addition, but one of those is a pair of claws. You can also see they have, it's hard to see on the ones I have here. Maybe you can see it on this one. They have a stalked pair of eyes. So you can see those little blue eyes there. Oops. Like other crustaceans, they are crustaceans. They have 2 pairs of antennae. So they have this longer pair here and a shorter pair right there. I'm surprised this hermit crab is not pulling back into its shell with me touching it like that. So the name hermit crab, they stay home, so we kind of made an allusion to the hermit crabs isolating. As you can see, there are a lot of them in this tide pool, and they don't necessarily keep their distance from each other. They can crowd together, but they kind of stay home. But that's because they take their home with them wherever they go. And also, typically, this one is lucky for us, kind of coming out so we can see it a little bit better. But often when you, as these are doing, when you pick them up, they'll pull back into their shell so that it's, they're hermits. They're retiring. They are, they're pretty opportunistic. So that means that they will eat kind of anything they can. So they have claws. Hermit crabs come in different sizes. I mean, you can see these very small ones, and then you saw the giant red claw hermit crab, the giant red hermit crab, and those can even get into large queen conchs. So the giant red hermit crabs can get very large. So the answer to that question would kind of depend on the size of the crab, but they will eat. They'll scavenge for dead things. They'll eat algae. They will sometimes, catch and kill little things like worms and things. So it kind of depends on the species. It depends on their size, and it kind of depends on what's available. They'll kind of eat a lot of whatever is available. They're not very picky eaters. So we've got snails moving here. And
they make a lot of noise.
So they do, and if you have them out, actually, sometimes you can hear them making noise like bubbling or sort of clicking their mouth parts or legs.
So when we talk about the ecosystem, what is their main role within our ecosystem?
So these hermit crabs are scavengers. So they would cruise around in this area that we're in, that we can show you, and they would eat algae. There's a lot of algae in this water. If there are so you can see oysters in here, or oyster shells. So if, for example, an oyster died in here, and then it, was this sort of decaying animal, this dead animal. They would, kind of cruise around in here and clean up things like that. So they scavenge the tridivores. So they're, I don't know, maybe you could think of them as like little Roombas in here.
So what's one fun fact about hermit crabs that most people don't know that we haven't chatted about?
Okay, I'll tell you a little story about my experience with hermit crabs. So I have watched hermit crabs that we have in an aquarium, and so I'll use this one as an example. It is starting to outgrow this shell, so you can see that it's not able to fully retract. And when this hermit crab is safe in the aquarium, safe from predators, but when they're in the wild and they're not able to retract into their shells, see if I can find one that can give you an example. So that one can retract a lot better into its shell, so it's better protected in its shell. So their growth will slow when they start to outgrow their shell, but it's about time for this hermit crab to move into a new shell. So I have watched hermit crabs check out a new shell. So if it found a new shell, it would examine it. So it would take that shell and maybe hold on to it and turn it around and examine it for cracks or holes, and they will sometimes still live in shells that are cracked and damaged. So it wouldn't necessarily eliminate that shell, especially if it didn't have other options, but it will sort of evaluate the shell's potential as a home. And then it will, they don't crawl around without their shells typically looking for a new shell. What they would do is they would hold the new shell close to the old one, and they would quickly scoot from the old shell into the new one, and they would crawl around in it, kind of feel it out. I've seen them move back from the bigger shell that they moved into their old shell. For whatever reason, they decided that the old shell was better for them. And another thing that I have not witnessed this, but I recently learned that hermit crabs will sometimes form like a waiting chain for shells. So if a hermit crab finds a shell that seems to have good potential, but it's not necessarily right for that particular hermit crab, it may wait beside that shell, because there may be another hermit crab that comes along to move into that shell, leaving its old shell vacant, and then the old shell may be a good fit for the one that found the bigger shell, but it was too big for it.
So they're kind of like house hunters.
And so apparently they will sometimes form chains of like even up to 20 hermit crabs, like waiting in a line for some big hermit crab to come along and find this shell that's too big for the others, move into it, leaving its own vacant for the next one to move in, and so on down the line.
And so one of the last things that I have here is, so we look at this big guy, he's got claws. Can he hurt you with those, or is that more just for his eating?
If you compare this to these smaller hermit crabs, it's primarily for eating, but it can pinch. So if you look at a crab's claws, often the size of the muscle in there is for pinching, and that is often for defense, but also for feeding. So the size of this one, the size of the muscle in there is pretty small. The size of the muscle in here is pretty big. So this crab is pretty strong. If it pinched me, it could hurt. And it can pinch, but they're primarily used for feeding. The shell is its primary protection. So the claws are used more for feeding, less for defense.
So Mendel, another last question. How long can hermit crabs live? Do we have a lifespan on them? On the striped ones that we have here?
Oh, you're so funny. So I say that because that is a common question that I get about animals. People often want to know how long animals live, and I'm often flummoxed by that question. I don't know the answer. So I looked it up. And what I found was that it's uncertain. We're uncertain about the lifespan of hermit crabs. So sometimes it's difficult to determine lifespan depends on the animal and how they're studied, but it can be difficult to determine lifespan for animals in the wild. And if you have animals in captivity, they may have an artificially short lifespan, or they might have an artificially long lifespan, depending on how they're kept, how good our understanding is about keeping them healthy. And so I don't know the answer to that question, Angela.
Well, Mendel, I'm
going to add to that and say that I think that there is a lot of idea that scientists know the answers to everything. And so I would like to say, on ending on that note, I don't know, that is a wonderful opportunity for learning. So that's the thing about science, is that we're always asking questions we don't know the answers to, and we're seeking those answers. So it's always good to find questions we don't know the answers to. It leaves us with scope.
Well, Mendel, I think everybody appreciates. We do hate we couldn't do this live from the salt marsh, but we did chat about hermit crabs, and keep posted for the schedule for August.
And also, we do bring people out here for our summer excursions. So if you are interested in joining us out here at the Salt Marsh, we have a couple of dates left for our summer excursion program, if you want to check that out on our website.
Awesome. Thank you, Mendel.
Thanks.